In the late 1960s, rock and roll collided with death, violence, occult symbolism, and the seeming collapse of a cultural dream. At the centre of it all stood the Rolling Stones. By 1969, Brian Jones was dead, Mick Jagger was singing as Lucifer, and all the while the tragedy of Altamont waited upon the horizon. A storm is threatening, so let's seek some shelter here on Things Visible and Invisible. Patrick Humphries is one of Britain's most respected rock biographers. A music journalist for more than 40 years, he's written definitive books on everyone, from Bob Dylan and Nick Drake to Tom Waits and the Rolling Stones. His book, Rolling Stones 69, explores the band's darkest and most transformative year, and he joins me down the line from his home in London. Patrick, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Hello.
Patrick, would it be fair to say that 1969 is not just the darkest year of the Rolling Stones, but also a sort of turning point in their careers?
Well, it's certainly, I think, for the Stones. I mean, they've been going for 6 years by then, and they'd had their ups and downs, as duly documented in certainly the UK press. 69, I mean, look back on it now, God, how did they get through it? The year was marked. I mean, I think the two events that really make it so significant: the death of Brian Jones, who was the founder member of the band, and the famous Altamont concert in California in 1969, where the Hells Angels killed a member of the audience. I mean, they're the two. Well, I think in a way, the end of the 60s. I mean, yes, 1969 was the last year of the 60s, but I think Altamont, you'd had the Woodstock Festival that summer, which had gone beautifully. It was all peace and love, and 500,000 people in the field, no problem at all. And a few months later at Altamont, this racetrack, this crowd of hundreds of thousands of young people come to see the greatest rock and roll band in the world for free, being stomped on by Hells Angels, having motorcycles ridden over them, and 4 deaths. I think that was tragically the end of the 60s, and the Stones came to represent that in a way.
Before we get to the seminal events of 1969, Patrick, I think it's probably wise to go back a little bit. There will be people watching this who have no idea who the Rolling Stones are or were, or where they came from, more importantly. But so before we get to their fame and how we arrive at 1969, let's back up a little bit and talk about their origin story. In fact, I think I'm right in saying that they came from a part of London not far from where you're speaking to me tonight.
Yes, I mean, Dartford's about 20 miles from London. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards grew up there. Mick was a student at the London School of Economics. They both loved blues music, rhythm and blues from America, which was very difficult to get hold of in this country in the early 60s. Mick would write off to record stores in America to get obscure LPs, and it was that that really bonded them. Mick was on the station platform in Dartford, and Keith was waiting for a train, and he saw Mick had a Chuck Berry album and some rare LPs, and they got talking, and that's where it all began, really. One of those incredible. I mean, they'd known each other since they were kids, but they'd lost touch. And the two Rolling Stones that everyone knows, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, bonded on a station platform, and that began, this incredible. Incredible. I mean, the fact they're still going. We're sitting here in London in the 21st century, and they've announced a new album and possibility of some live dates, which puts them in the record books if they weren't up there already. So they began as a covers band. I mean, they what they wanted to do was let a British audience, a UK audience, hear the music that they loved from America, rhythm and blues, Chicago, Delta blues, which was getting no airplay over here. There was not much known about it. So Mick and Keith, they really were, proselytizing. They wanted to get this music across. So when the Stones began, it was all cover versions. and they would at the end of each song they would respectfully stop and say that's the song by Howlin' Wolf or Robert Johnson or whatever, and the record it was on, so that their audience would then go and buy the original, which was great. I mean, they were really educators as much as anything. But it was, in fairness, it was Brian Jones' band. Brian came from Cheltenham, which is about 70 miles from London, and again, equally possessed by that music from America, the blues particularly. And he put an advert in a local in a music paper saying, like-minded people. There's a club in Ealing, one of the London suburbs, where Mick and Keith and Brian, Paul Jones from Manfred Mann, everybody went there, to Eric Clapton, to hear the sort of music they love. And so the Stones began as Brian's band. I mean, it was he was the guy who chased up the BBC to try and get some studio time, to try and get airplay. They were Brian's band, and so they were a covers band up to a point where they just had to stop doing cover versions because the Beatles had come along. And in 1963, that was the year of the Beatlemania in Britain, tsunami of Beatlemania. And the thing about them, which I think is of interest, is that the Beatles arrived as this self-formed unit. They didn't need to rely on Tin Pan Alley or cover versions because they had the two great songwriters, Lennon and McCartney, in their ranks. So they could just release songs that they had written. And it was the Stones' first manager, Andrew Oldham, who legendarily locked Mick and Keith in the kitchen to say, right, well, you're not coming out until you've written the song. And they did, and they weren't very good, the early ones. But I mean, this is where the first split in the Stones began. Brian, for all his many, many musical talents and charisma and vision, couldn't write songs. I mean, he was a fantastic instrumentalist, but he couldn't write songs. Whereas from early on, Mick and Keith, Jagger and Richards were the Stones songwriters, and that's really what took them into the next level.
And what you're saying as well, Patrick, because we better also flesh it out, I guess. There's also Charlie Watts on drums and Bill Wyman on bass. But this kind of hierarchy within a band, where the songwriters, Mick and Keith, it sets them apart a little bit from Brian. As you said, it was Brian's band to begin with, but probably by about 64, 65, it was beginning to be Mick and Keith's band.
Yeah, I mean, 64 was Little Red Rooster, blues cover. And then after that, it was Jagger Richards originals. And Brian, for all his many talents, just couldn't write songs. And so the axis shifted and it became, effectively became Mick and Keith's band. Yes, I mean, one of the great rhythm sections, Bill Wyman on bass, Charlie Watts on drums, that provided the bedrock for the music, and Brian could alternate on keyboards, on guitar, pretty well any instrument he put in front of him. I mean, he provided the colouring, but I think the greatness of the Stones came from the Jagger Richards combinations throughout 64, 65, Satisfaction, Get Off My Cloud, Paint It Black. I mean, all these great songs,
so
which on occasion they still play. I mean, so that's when the axis shifted, and the Stones, I think, began to become the group that everyone knows today.
So very quickly, they became very popular in the UK. How did they manage to crack the United States?
Well, the Beatles went over in 64, and I mean, British acts had some success in America. I mean, Vera Lynn had hit singles in America, but no British act had ever sustained a career in America. And what's great about the Beatles is that they went over in 64. I Want to Hold Your Hand was #1. They've appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, largest ever TV audience in American history. 73 million people watched them. And the next day, everybody from Jim Morrison to John Fogerty to the Byrds went out and formed a band. So there was this mad British obsession. So in the wake of the Beatles, the British invasion, came the Yardbirds, the Who, and the Rolling Stones. And already they were painted as like the bad boys. The Beatles were sort of seen as quite squeaky clean. The Stones were slightly rebellious. They They had longer hair than the Beatles. They were quite scruffy. They were quite insolent, not necessarily rude, just slightly insolent. So they had their slightly chipper edge to them. And that appealed certainly to American audiences. So yes, by certainly 65, 66, they were, I would say the two main groups of the period were the Beatles and the Stones.
Now, as you say, the Rolling Stones had a reputation as the bad boys of rock and had a number of run-ins with the law in various ways. And they became sort of what we would describe today as tabloid fodder. They were never out of the newspapers and they were very good for the press. I want to move it a little bit further, though, along, Patrick, to 1967. 1967, the Beatles were doing a day in the life at Sgt. Pepper's, and the whole psychedelia was very much a la mode at that time. The Stones took a decidedly darker tone from the beginning. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that album of 67 and how they came up with the concept?
Well, yes, I mean, the Beatles were leading from the front. I mean, everybody followed the Beatles. And 1967 was one of their many, many years of brilliance. It began with the release of Penny Lane, The Strawberry Fields Forever, which many still think is the greatest ever rock single. And then in June came Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which it's not even the best Beatles album, but I think in history, Sgt. Pepper is the album. It's a line in the sand. I think before Sgt. Pepper, it's pop music. After Sgt. Pepper, it's rock music. People started taking it seriously. It was the first album to have lyrics on the sleeve. It was a gatefold sleeve. You've got an insert. Even the inner sleeve was coloured. There was a play out when you could put it on your record player. It never ended. There was nonsense at the end of it, which could go on forever. And it was an absolute landmark, a breakthrough album. And the Stones, I think, felt they had to come up with something comparable. And what they released was the Satanic Majesties Request, which is, how can I put it politely? It's a terrible album. I mean, they're just so obviously trying to be the Beatles. There aren't the songs on it to make it halfway decent. The title is taken from a British passport. I think it's their Britannic Majesties, and they call it the Satanic Majesty to play out that dark side of them. And it was an elaborate sleeve, and but everyone, I mean, even diehard Stones fans think it was a bad move. It palled in comparison with Sgt. Pepper, and then of course '67 famously Mick and Keith and were busted at Keith's farmhouse by the police, caught taking drugs. They went on trial. They were sentenced to prison. I think they spent a night each in jail, and then got off on appeal. And it was like the establishment wanted to crack down on them. They did see them as a bad influence. In the trial, Marianne Faithfull was wandering around Keith's property in Redlands, clad only in a rug, and the prosecution made great play of this. And Keith's response from the dock in court was, we are not old men. We are not concerned with your petty morals. I mean, it's really defiant. 2 fingers up to the establishment stuff. So that kind of confirmed the Stones as the bad boys of rock and roll. And Satanic Majesties, I think they did as almost like an afterthought, but it's not a good record. And I think that I think they knew it early on. I mean, funnily enough, the single they did, which isn't on the album, We Love You. I mean, everything was love that year. All you need is love. And, if you're going to San Francisco with some flowers in your hair, all that peace and love. And funnily enough, I think the Stones single, We Love You, is actually better than All You Need Is Love. I think it's one of their great singles. Unfortunately, that didn't translate to the Satanic Majesties album. And I think after it came out, the reception was muted. And I think at the end of '67, I think they really thought we have to rethink where we're going with our music.
Well, it was certainly a preamble to what came in '68. Would it be fair to say, Patrick, that unlike the Beatles, there was a kind of dark undercurrent to much of the Stones' music from there to the end of the 1960s at least? I'm thinking of songs like Sympathy for the Devil, but not just that. There seemed to be a sort of almost like an atmosphere around the Stones. Mick Jagger... Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, 67 was very much peace and love. I mean, it was patchouli oil and caftans and flowers in your hair, and there really was a nice vibe to it. 68 got a lot harder. I mean, 68 was the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. Was Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy shot. Riots in America everywhere. Big anti-Vietnam demonstrations in London, around the world. Student riots in Paris, which were students and trade unionists against the de Gaulle government. Vietnam raging in the war in Vietnam raging, and with no real likelihood of America winning. I mean, it was America thought they'd got the North Vietnamese beaten, and early in '68, the Tet Offensive really almost lost America the war. And I think that's when they realised that it was going to be a long haul. So you had riots, you had invasions, you had wars. The Middle East was simmering as ever, and it was a very, very much a change. It's almost like somebody flicks a switch from 67 to 68, and musically, it was a time when people took a step back, looked at what was going on. Bob Dylan, he'd been quiet for about 18 months following a bike crash in 1966. Along with the Beatles and the Stones, Dylan was the third, crown. So let me do that again. I think along with the Beatles and the Stones, Dylan was the other king, if you like. And he'd been very quiet for almost 2 years. So his first album of 1968, with John Wesley Harding, which was effectively a country and western album, very, very far removed from what they'd been doing beforehand. The Beatles, after climbing the peak with Sgt. Pepper, going as far as rock music could possibly go, they did the White Album, which came out in '68, which is all sorts of things. A bit of Hollywood showbiz, there was hard rock and roll, there was ballads, there was everything on that. And the Stones really took a step back and thought, what can we do? And they came out with Beggar's Banquet in '68, which I think all the fans agree is the beginning of what's been called their Imperial phase. I think it was the beginning of when the Stones really did up the game and went on to become, certainly live, the greatest rock and roll band in the world.
Yes, I mean, there's a definite shift, not just in mood, but also in their professionalism. In some ways, it's interesting because you allude to the 1967 Beatles renaissance, when the Beatles moved from sort of the Fab Four to becoming a much more serious cultural entity. In a similar sort of a way, 68 marks the Stones transiting from a pop group to something much more serious and much more dangerous in a sense. However, unlike the Beatles and perhaps many of their contemporaries, there's a kind of dark undercurrent running through the Stones. There's a lot of references to, shall we say, violence, to the occult, to the devil himself. What do you put this down to, Patrick, in your researches? Was this just Mick Jagger being a showman, or was there something sort of in the atmosphere around the band at this time?
No, I think there was a real interest. I think one of the things about the '60s, there was a great deal of curiosity. Eastern religion. I mean, the Beatles, famously in '68, after admitting to taking LSD, went off to meditate with the Maharishi in India. So meditation was cool in 1968. There was a lot of people reading, quite complicated books. They were thinking quite complicated thoughts about wider issues, and part of that was I wouldn't say an interest in the occult, although Aleister Crowley, the great beast, the great Satanist, was on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. It's one of the people on the cover. So there was kind of an interest in that. I mean, I remember the Dennis Wheatley satanic, not black magic novels from the '60s, and there was that sort of, it was all part of what was going on. And I think the Stones certainly were seen, they'd already been cast as the bad boys. And I think they thought, well, yeah, let's just take that a bit further. And you mentioned Sympathy for the Devil. originally it was the line was "Who Shot Kennedy," and then of course after Bobby, it was "Who Shot the Kennedys." So there was this. As I say, I think there was a lot of violence in the air, and I don't think it's particularly marked on Beggar's Banquet, apart from Sympathy for the Devil. But I mean, that was something that really that they seem to quite like that image of being the Mavericks, of being the outlaws.
Yes, I'm wondering how much of it was stylistic. I mean, uh, there have been rumours, I suppose, that some of those around the Stones were perhaps more involved in the occult than perhaps the Stones themselves. Do you put any credence to that?
No, I think they were curious. I mean, there are some great photos of them at Stonehenge. Um, they were taking a lot of drugs, which I think if you're lucky can expand your consciousness, and can take you into very interesting areas. And I think they were, as I say, I keep coming back to the word curiosity. I think they were very curious about all this stuff that was going on. I don't think it was manufactured. I don't think it was, let's be seen to be the bad boys. They just seemed to get that all around them. And I mean, they look the part as well. I mean, uh, they were always very stylish in their rather loose way, and they had this retinue of people who were interested. Marianne Faithfull was a great reader. She put Mick onto all sorts of stuff. I mean, Mick's a bright guy. I mean, very well read, very well educated, very curious, and I think that curiosity in certain Stones lyrics was Mick. But Keith, of course, had this incredible knack of just coming up with just the right riff, just the right musicality. And to his credit, Brian Jones did a lot of the musical colouring in '68. But yeah, they were all looking. I think they were conscious of the fact that the '60s was coming to an end. They were only in their late 20s, but nobody had really made a career out of pop music. I mean, Cliff Richard, bless him, and his contemporaries, they would be doing summer seasons and pantomimes, which you couldn't really imagine the Stones or the Beatles doing. And I think they were all facing up to, they were all coming up to 30, and the decade was ending. This tumultuous decade was ending. They've been so much part of. They were coming up to 30. It was like, where does it go from here?
Yeah. So 68 trundles along, and we get to 69. Now, 69. Would it be fair to say, Patrick, that the Rolling Stones, as they were at that time, begin to implode, they begin to fall apart, or was it simply that Brian Jones began to fall apart?
Well, Brian was in a pretty bad way. You look at photos of him from '68 onwards. I mean, again, the Stones tried to. They were one step behind the Beatles. In Christmas 1967, UK television premiered the Magical Mystery Tour, the Beatles film, which was a disaster. I mean, it was their manager, Brian Epstein, had just died. They were rudderless. Paul decided they needed a project to occupy them. He came up with the Magical Mystery Tour. The music's great. I mean, the music's fantastic. But it was this psychedelic caper. It was shown in black and white on British television, so any sort of psychedelic frippery was lost. It was not well. It was really the first time in about 4 years the Beatles had taken a fall, and I think Mick thought, right, well, we'll jump on this. So he came up with the idea of the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, which was going to be a television special with the Stones performing and special guests. But it was legend has it that the Stones were good but not great. Brian is not in a good place. You can see the footage, and the Who just blew them off stage by all accounts. So it was shelved for many years. So nobody saw it for many years. So they left '68. They went into '69. Brian was not in a good place, and to such an extent that they had to sack him. The Stones, Mick, Keith, and Charlie went down to Brian's home in Sussex and said, "Look, sorry, you're just not cutting it, and you're going to have to go." So he was sacked from the band that he'd founded. He died tragically in a swimming pool. I mean, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories. I think he was asthmatic. I think he'd probably taken too many drugs, too much to drink, couldn't get his breath, he drowned. But it came just days before the Stones played their Hyde Park concert. I believe the largest gathering in London since VE Day in 1945. Probably 500,000 people in Hyde Park to see the Stones for free, which was great, with their new guitarist Mick Taylor taking over from Brian. And I mean, not a great show. The sound was pretty terrible, but it sort of said, "Well, we're back. You know, we're here." So they were coming out the back of Beggars Banquet. Honky Tonk Women, the new single, one of the all-time great Stones songs. So it's, you know, summer of '69, they really were again at the top of their game, but without Brian. You know, Mick famously did that poem for Brian's memory in that white dress, and it's one of the abiding images of the '60s. There's real tragedy there, but you know, it's testament to the Stones, to Mick, to Keith, Charlie, bless him, Bill, Mick Taylor. They carried on. They were not going to be ground down, and so they had Honky Tonk Women, and then they needed a new album in time for Christmas 1969, which was became Let It Bleed.
Would you say, Patrick, that the death of Brian Jones, that he had, if you like, exited from the Stones some time before, really, not just physically deciding not to be a member of the Rolling Stones, but that he, because you alluded to the fact that Keith and Mick had become the focal point of the group. Was it a kind of a case that Brian was just sort of moving further and further away from that, and that culminated in his leaving in '69?
Well, I think, yes. I mean, I think there were all sorts of emotional issues. I mean, Brian's girlfriend was poached by Keith Richards. I mean, there was all sorts of stuff going on there. But I think he knew that, as I say, I really do think that for all the post-mortems and examinations, I think the Stones stopped being Brian's band when he couldn't write the songs they needed, and Mick and Keith could. That's when the dynamic shifted. And by '69, he was in a bad way. You see pictures of him. He was not in a good way, taking too many drugs. But I think he had this lovely farm in Sussex, and his dad came down to see him, and they had a lovely reunion. And from what I gather, you know, he said, "Well, Dad, I'm very happy with where I am now. I think I can start a new group or whatever." And I think the future is very bright for him. And he died under still mysterious circumstances.
Well, just talk us through that a bit, if you wouldn't mind, Patrick, because there is still a lot of controversy. There's a lot of theories, as you say, around what happened or why what happened. I mean, he wasn't in a good place, as you say, but other people have said that he was about to begin a sort of new chapter in his life. He was quite sort of optimistic about the future. Talk us through a little bit about the circumstances of his death.
Well, yes, I think there were. I think there was one interview he may have given, or somebody said that he was very excited by the music of Creedence Clearwater Revival. Great band. And I think he felt perhaps that was the direction he might go in, but we'll never know. I mean, he was yes, he drowned in his own swimming pool. The theory is that one of the there was a builder doing some work for him, drowned him, to be honest, there are so many conspiracy theories around it. I think that he was quite a frail creature, Brian. I mean, he was quite frail. He was asthmatic. He wasn't strong. You look at, I mean, Mick's dad was a physical exercise teacher. Mick's strong. You look at him now. I mean, he can still get into clothes he was wearing 50 years ago. You know, Keith has got this incredible chemistry. God knows what's keeping him on his feet. Brian was a lot frailer. Brian was a lot less strong. And I do think that, you know, he was asthmatic, and I think there was a party. I think he either took too much to drink, he maybe took some drugs. He went for a swim in the pool, which was heated. I think it's quite possible he just dozed off and drowned. I really don't buy the conspiracy theories. I think it's just a terribly sad end. And of course, he was only 27 when he died.
That's right. Have the Stones ever? I know they commented at Hyde Park, or there was that sort of eulogy to Brian Jones. But I mean, one of the things that other people have said about the Stones is that bad things happen and they kind of move on. And I know you said that put it in a positive sense, that they reassembled and got on with the job. But has there been much? I mean, I've followed the Stones almost as long as you have, Patrick, and I'm not conscious of Brian Jones really being mentioned in interviews or referenced in any way. Or am I missing something?
No, I think there's a kind of revisionist theory about many things in rock and roll, and I think one of them is that Brian was deserved more respect for his work with the Stones, which, I think is fair enough. I mean, in the early days it was Brian's group. I mean, he's the guy who badgered record companies and the BBC, and really motored the group forward. But there wasn't that core strength that Mick had, or Keith indeed. And I think there was this weakness in Brian, this vulnerability that left him vulnerable in many ways, on many levels. And I don't think he was ever in a particularly satisfactory relationship. I mean, there was illegitimate children. I think people have lost count of the number of illegitimate children he sired. He was a rather tragic figure. And I think, as I say, you see those photos when towards the end of his life. There are a couple where he's looking really happy. But, and maybe if he'd lived, something would have come of his life creatively. We'll never know. I mean, the Stones, I think there's a you could call it coldness. There's something about Mick, Keith, the Rolling Stones that just keeps on keeping on. And 2 days after how many days after their founder member dies, they're playing in front of 500,000 people. They're going back to make a new album. They carry on, they persevere, and there's that inner strength of the band. And I think Brian had lost that. And had he lived, I think it's terribly sad when anybody dies at the age of 27, particularly somebody who'd had such an influence on the group that he founded. I don't know. I keep coming back to this thing about songwriting. The great groups, I think, The Who, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, all Bob Dylan, the band. It's the songs that last. And Brian was just sadly incapable of writing songs, and Mick and Keith were. They could do it and kept doing it and keep doing it.
Now, the Rolling Stones had one fatality by June 1969. They were to close the year with another one. In your researches, I'm sort of moving it beyond Altamont a little bit, Patrick. Again, if you think of the impact, for example, the death of Brian Epstein had on the Beatles, not just professionally, but also personally, the Stones seem to have sort of just weathered this and moved on. As I say, one fatality would be bad enough, but two in close, that came about through their actions in a sense. Do you get any sense of remorse from the Rolling Stones, or was it a case of let's just move on, let's just keep going?
Well, I think they'd lost him. Frankly, I think they'd lost him before he died. I think there's that famous film, Jean-Luc Godard film, Sympathy for the Devil, or 1+1, whatever it's called. Watching them recording Sympathy for the Devil, and Brian's there physically, but not really. Rumours had it that they unplugged his guitar because he just wasn't. So I think they'd kind of resigned themselves to the fact that he wasn't going to be around. And I think it takes. I think you have to be very strong to survive in rock and roll, and to survive. We're talking about a group that they began when Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister. They've been doing this for so long. They're still the Rolling Stones. And that takes a kind of a strength and a drive, which Mick can supply and Keith can on occasion. They're motored by Mick Jagger. And I think that goes back to after Brian died, I think, yeah, Mick really took over the mantle. They had a manager, Alan Klein, who was promising them great things. He did get them some long overdue royalties financially. I think he was quite a good thing for them, but they needed their tax situation was just ridiculous. They needed to go into tax exile, which they did in the early 70s. As the 60s were winding down, I won't say they were struggling, but there was a kind of a gap. I mean, they could see, they could sense, although the Beatles haven't broken up officially, the last time the Beatles played together on the Apple Roof in January 1969, the rumor was, and the Stones, Mick would have had his ear to the ground, that they weren't going to carry on as a group. So again, Mick probably saw that as a gap for the Stones to plug. And of course, they did that in magnificent form by coming out with the Let It Bleed album at the end of '69.
And then we have Altamont and the tragedy which happened there. It's a very, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the famous film of Altamont, the documentary made around it. Mick Jagger is a very, shall we say, seismic character on stage. I mean, for example, he's dressed as Lucifer for a start. They're singing Sympathy for the Devil. And I think I'm right in saying that they had said previously that whenever they play that song, something always goes wrong. Or is that just legend, Patrick?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they weren't. I mean, legend had them playing Sympathy for the Devil when the guy was killed. It wasn't. They were playing something. I think it was Painted Black.
That's right.
They wasn't. They weren't playing Sympathy for the Devil. Yes, I think there was that element to, but I think Mick and the Stones saw a gap to be plugged, and the Beatles had given up touring in '66. So when the Stones went back for this American tour in '69, it was very different. There was no screaming. I mean, there was no sort of 30-minute sets and teenage girls screaming themselves hysterically. Audiences after, when Rolling Stone magazine came out in 1967, it took pop music seriously. It took rock music seriously. So there was an audience ready for to sit and listen to the music. And so the Stones came out for that American tour. I mean, top of their game again. I mean, they had Mick Taylor on guitar. They had this terrific catalogue to work on. Beggar's Banquet plus Let It Bleed was on the stocks. And yeah, I mean, they're great. You see footage of those shows. They're just fantastic. I mean, they are just fantastic. You know, they are the greatest rock and roll band in the world. And the problem was that the hippie culture wanted them to be more in tune with them, which meant basically playing a free festival. Because Woodstock, people forget, Woodstock actually you had to buy tickets for. It just happened that the crowds were so big, they declared it a free festival. It was a money-making exercise, but it became synonymous with the whole free festival. You know, you shouldn't have to pay for your music. And there was a lot of pressure on the Stones when they undertook their American tour in '69, particularly from Rolling Stone magazine. You know, hey guys, you know, we're paying, you know, $6 a ticket, and you know, is it time? You shouldn't think about a free festival? And the pressure was on, and they didn't want to alienate that audience. So they said, "Yeah, okay, let's do a free festival. You know, we can top Woodstock." And I think in the back of his mind, Mick knew that the Beatles wouldn't be playing. They'd never played the festival. They wouldn't be performing again. So the way was out for the Stones to really round off the year with a great album and a fantastic free festival with, you know, 500,000 people coming to pay obeisance. You know, so it would have been a great way to end the year, to end the decade. But there are all sorts of problems. The original site of the Altamont Festival was a speedway. No, I'm sorry, that's the original site of the Altamont Festival would have been perfect. Enough toilets, enough car parking. But there was an issue with the owners when they learned it was going to be filmed. They said, no, we'd want a percentage of the film, which went against what the Stones, Nick particularly, wanted. So they found this place at Altamont, which has now become synonymous with the worst aspects of rock and roll. And they got the Hells Angels in to police it. Now the Hells Angels, the Hells Angels policed the Hyde Park concert, but the English Hells Angels were very, very different from the American Hells Angels. The American Hells Angels were a biker gang. They were rebels. They were outlaws. I mean, these guys were nasty bits of work, and they were promised $500 worth of free beer to keep an eye on things at Altamont, and it went horribly wrong from the beginning. There are all these, peace and love hippies, and these quite brutal. You look at the film and you can see the scorn, the disdain, the almost hate the Angels had for the crowd. And there's one moment when Mick's up performing before the tragedy happened, and the looks on these guys' faces, this guy doing his fag dancing, and you almost interact. They want him as well. There was just a bad vibe about Altamont. I spoke to people who'd been there and interviewed musicians who read about it, and they said from early on there was just like a really bad vibe about it, and it climaxed with the Stones coming on very late. I mean, there was no proper organisation for it. There was a lot of bad drugs being passed around. Woodstock apparently had very good drugs. Altamont had bad drugs. There are a lot of people tripping out. You can see it in the film. There's all this chaos, which, if it had been well ordered, could have been controlled. But the Angels went into that. They were driving their motorbikes through the crowd. They were, it was an awful. And by the time the Stones came on, God, anything could happen, and it did. And you can see in the film now what actually happened. I mean, it looks like this guy Meredith Hunter pulled a gun and was going to shoot Mick Jagger, and immediately the Hells Angels jumped on him and he was stabbed to death, and you can see it on film. And I mean, that's, for many people, that's the end of the 1960s.
Yeah. Unfortunately, Patrick, we've come to the end of our time together. Tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can pick up a copy of Rolling Stones 1969.
Well, there's a wonderful thing called Amazon. It's out there. And interestingly, after I did the Stones book, I really enjoyed going through the back issues of Melody Maker and Rolling Stone. And I said to a very dear friend, I think I'm quite keen to do a book on the Beatles, but there's been so much about. And Bill said, yeah, but you've interviewed Paul, George and Rick. You've interviewed the 3 surviving Beatles. You should go and do it. And I said, yeah. So I did. I did the Beatles book after. So it's on my website. It's Patrick Humphries, all lowercase.co.uk. It's been great. It's been a lovely opportunity to talk and reminisce.
Patrick, for now, thanks so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.